Every year, Valentine's Day leaves something behind. These 5 stories are what stayed. This is the complete collection. I noticed it first because the air in the kitchen felt cooler than the rest of the apartment, even though the heat had been running all morning. It wasn't cold exactly, just a thin difference, like standing near an open window that isn't actually open. I stood there longer than I needed to, holding my coffee, watching the steam thin out faster than usual. On the table was a small box wrapped in off-white paper. It hadn't been there when I woke up. I was sure of that. I'd come in earlier to rinse my mug, and the table had been clear except for the placemat I never moved. The box sat centered now, square with the table edge, the paper folded tight at the corners. No ribbon, no writing. I didn't touch it at first. I watched the light from the window creep across the surface as the morning went on, slow enough that it was hard to tell if it was moving at all. The paper had a faint texture, almost fabric-like, and one corner was dented inward, as if it had been set down carefully and then adjusted. I tried to remember if I'd ordered something. The thought came and went without settling. It felt easier to stand there than to think it through. Outside, a car passed, tires humming on damp pavement. Somewhere down the block, someone laughed once and then stopped. The clock on the stove ticked, steady and unhelpful. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee and something sweeter underneath, though I hadn't baked or cooked anything that morning. Eventually, I set the mug down and rested my fingers on the edge of the box. The paper was cool. Not cold enough to surprise me, but cooler than the room. When I pressed lightly, I could feel something firm inside, not shifting. I slid the box closer and peeled back one edge of the paper, careful not to tear it. The sound was soft, almost polite. Inside was a smaller box, white, unmarked. I lifted the lid. There were chocolates inside, dark ones arranged in 2 neat rows, each piece shaped slightly differently. No brand name, no label, just the faint sheen on the surface and a smell that was richer than anything I'd bought recently. I knew those chocolates. I hadn't thought about them in years, not directly. They were from a small place she used to like, a shop we'd found by accident when we were still learning each other's habits. They didn't ship, they didn't advertise. They closed the year after she died. I stood there looking down at them, waiting for the recognition to fade into something reasonable. It didn't. The first year it happened, I'd laughed. That year, it had been a bouquet of white flowers left near my mailbox downstairs, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. No card, no return information. I'd assumed a neighbor had made a mistake, or that someone in the building had a sense of humor they'd regret once they realized the date. I left them by the curb when they started to wilt. The second year, it was a scarf. Folded neatly, soft gray wool, the exact shade she used to wear when it snowed. That time, I felt a small, sharp annoyance more than anything else. I told myself it was coincidence layered on top of grief, that my mind was too eager to connect patterns that weren't there. The third year, it was a book. A used paperback, dog-eared in places I remembered. I didn't open it. I put it on the shelf and told myself it was easier not to think about how unlikely it was. After that, I stopped trying to explain it. Every February, on the same day, something arrived. Always simple, always familiar, never accompanied by anything that asked for a response. The timing was precise without being dramatic. Sometimes early in the morning, sometimes late afternoon. Once, just after dusk, when the light outside had gone flat and colorless. I never saw who brought them. I never mentioned it to anyone, not because I thought they wouldn't believe me, but because I didn't want the questions. The moment you say something out loud, it changes shape. It becomes something you have to manage. I carried the chocolates to the counter and stood there, unsure what to do next. The kitchen felt quieter than it should have. Not silent exactly, just subdued, as if the sounds had been turned down a notch. I picked one up and turned it over in my fingers. There was a faint mark on the bottom, a swirl where it had been set on a tray to cool. I remembered her telling me once that you could tell if they were fresh by the way they broke, clean and sharp, not crumbly. I set it back without tasting it. The day went on around the box. I answered emails. I washed a few dishes that hadn't needed washing. The light shifted, warming briefly in the afternoon before dulling again. The chocolates stayed where they were, untouched, their smell faint but persistent. By evening, the apartment had cooled enough that I put on a sweater. The heat kicked on, rattled for a moment, then settled. I sat at the table with the box between my hands and tried to think about her without letting my mind wander too far. She died in late winter, a short illness that moved faster than anyone expected. Hospital rooms that always smelled too clean, the way time stretched and collapsed at the same time. I remembered the sound of her voice more than anything else, steady even when she was tired. We'd never been sentimental about holidays. Valentine's Day had been an excuse for takeout and an early night. Once she'd brought home those chocolates and said, almost apologetically, that she liked them because they didn't try too hard. I lifted the lid again and chose one at random. It broke cleanly when I bit into it. The filling was smooth, not overly sweet, with a hint of something bitter underneath. It tasted exactly as I remembered. I ate another, slower this time, waiting for the flavor to change, to disappoint me. It didn't. When I finished the second one, I felt a small, unexpected tightening in my chest. Not pain exactly, but pressure. I closed the box and pushed it away. That night I slept poorly. Not because of dreams, but because I kept waking up, aware of the room in a way that felt unfinished. The dark was thicker than usual, the air cool against my face. At one point I thought I could smell the chocolates again, stronger than before, but when I turned my head, the scent thinned out and disappeared. In the morning, the box was gone. The space on the counter was empty, clean, no smudge, no paper. I stood there longer than necessary, staring at the spot where it had been. I checked the refrigerator, the cabinets, the trash. Nothing. I told myself I must have moved it without thinking. The explanation didn't stick, but I held on to it anyway. Over the next few days, small things felt off in ways I couldn't quite describe. The apartment seemed to cool faster at night. Sounds from outside felt closer than farther away, without any change I could point to. Once, while brushing my teeth, I caught the faint smell of wool, clean and dry, and then it was gone. On February 15th, there was another package. This one was larger, heavier. It sat near the mailbox again, wrapped in the same off-white paper. I carried it upstairs, my arms straining slightly with the weight. Inside was a ceramic bowl, deep blue, with a thin crack along the rim that had been filled and glazed over. It was hers. She dropped it years ago, laughed and said it gave the bowl character. We'd kept it anyway, using it for fruit until the crack widened enough to worry her. She'd thrown it out herself, insisting it wasn't worth the risk. I ran my thumb over the repaired line. The glaze was smooth, seamless. I didn't eat anything from that bowl. I set it on the counter and left it there. When I woke the next morning, it was still there, exactly where I'd put it. That was when the waiting started. I began to measure time by the distance between these moments. I stopped being surprised by the arrivals and started noticing the gaps around them. The way the apartment felt just before something appeared, the slight cooling of the air, the sense of pause, like the world holding still for half a breath. I didn't mark the dates anymore. I didn't need to. This year, the package arrived later than usual. Evening had already settled in, the light outside thin and gray. I was sitting at the table, reading without really absorbing the words, when I noticed the air shift. The smell came first, faint and sweet. The box was on the table. I hadn't heard anything. I hadn't moved. Inside was a small potted plant. A simple one, green leaves edged with pale veins. The soil was dark and damp, freshly watered. When I leaned closer, I could smell earth, rich and alive. She'd kept plants like this on the windowsill, talking to them under her breath while she trimmed dead leaves. After she died, they'd all withered within weeks, no matter how carefully I followed her routines. I set the plant by the window and watched it for a long time. The leaves were still. The room was quiet. My reflection in the glass looked tired, older than I remembered feeling. That night I woke just before dawn. The apartment was cold, the air heavy against my skin. From the other room I could smell damp soil again, stronger than before. When I reached the window, the plant's leaves were glossy with moisture. Tiny beads of water clung to the edges, catching the first light of morning. I hadn't watered it. I stood there, listening to the faint hum of the city waking up, and realized that whatever had been waiting all these years was no longer content to leave things behind and disappear. If you enjoy slow, unsettling horror stories, consider liking the video and subscribing. It always starts with the radiator. Not the sound of it turning on, that would be too obvious, but the moment right before, when the apartment is perfectly still and the metal hasn't decided yet whether to expand or stay quiet. That pause has a texture to it, a held breath. I notice it every year now. I was lying on my side, facing the wall, watching the faint glow of streetlight bleed through the blinds. The light never reaches the floor evenly. It breaks into thin stripes that stop just short of the bed. I'd been awake for a while, listening to the building settle, the distant hum of traffic thinning as the night moved on. February nights here are dry. The air feels lighter, cooler, like it doesn't want to linger. I remember thinking my throat felt scratchy and making a note to get water in a minute. I didn't move. That was when I heard him say my name. Not loudly, not urgently, just the way he used to when he was in the other room and needed to check if I was still awake. The sound came from my left, close enough that I could picture the exact place he would have been standing, leaning slightly against the counter, weight on one foot. I didn't turn my head. My first thought was that I'd imagined it, not in a dramatic way, more like noticing a familiar smell and then realizing it isn't really there. The brain does that sometimes when it's tired. It fills in gaps. I waited for it to repeat. It didn't. The radiator clicked then, a single sharp sound, and heat began to creep through the pipes. I lay there until my breathing slowed back down, until the moment passed and became something I could file away. The next morning, I didn't think about it at all. I went to work. I stood in line for coffee. I answered emails and nodded at the right times. The day moved forward in its usual unremarkable way. By evening, the night before had thinned into something flat and harmless. It wasn't until a week later, when the date came back around, that I noticed the pattern. Valentine's Day had never meant much to me after he died. The first year, I avoided it out of habit more than pain. The second year, I forgot it was coming until a coworker mentioned dinner plans. By the third, it was just another day with more red in store windows. That night, I went to bed early. The apartment was quiet in the way it gets after 10, when the neighbors settle in and the building seems to pull inward. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling fan, not moving, listening to the faint electrical buzz that meant it was on its lowest setting. I wasn't thinking about him. Not consciously. When the voice came, it felt closer than before. "Hey," he said. Just that. A single word. Calm. Familiar. The tone he used when he didn't want to startle me. My heart rate didn't spike. There was no rush of panic. What I felt instead was confusion, clean and sharp. I sat up. The room looked exactly the same. The same shadows, the same light slipping under the bedroom door from the hallway. The fan continued its slow rotation, the air brushing my skin with each pass. I said his name out loud, The sound of my own voice felt strange, too loud in the quiet room. Nothing answered. I waited, counting the seconds without meaning to. 10, 20, 30. Eventually, I lay back down. The next day, I told myself a story that fit. Stress, sleep deprivation, the mind replaying old recordings at inconvenient times. I'd read about things like that. It was common enough to feel boring once you put a name to it. What I didn't do was check the date. The third time happened a year later. By then, I'd moved to a different apartment across town. New street, new routine. I told myself that whatever pattern I thought I'd noticed wouldn't survive the change. Brains love to impose order where none exists. That night, I stayed up later than usual, scrolling through my phone until my eyes hurt. The apartment felt colder than it should have, despite the heat. I pulled the blanket higher and turned onto my side, facing the window. Outside, a bus sighed at the stoplight, then moved on. Somewhere above me, someone walked across their living room, the sound muffled and distant. I was just starting to drift when I heard him speak again. This time, he said my name twice. The sound didn't come from any one direction. It felt closer to my head than the room, as if it were being placed directly into the space between thoughts. The cadence was unmistakable, the small pause between the syllables, the way his voice dipped at the end. I sat up so fast the blanket slid to the floor. My mouth was dry, my hands felt cold against my thighs. I listened, hard, straining for any sign that this was something external, someone outside, a television through the wall, a radio left on by mistake. There was nothing. I didn't sleep after that. I lay there until morning, watching the light change, telling myself over and over that if it didn't happen again, it didn't mean anything. It didn't happen again. Not that year. I started paying attention after that, though I didn't admit it to myself. I kept mental notes I pretended were casual observations. The way the apartment felt at night in mid-February, the quality of the silence, the way my thoughts slowed, as if something were waiting for me to stop moving. I didn't hear him every year. That was almost worse. Some years the night passed without incident. I would lie awake, tense, waiting for a sound that never came. By morning, I'd feel foolish, embarrassed by my own anticipation. Other years, it happened once, always on the same night, never during the day, never when anyone else was around. I tried recording the room one year, just my phone on the nightstand, screen dark, microphone open. I told myself it was for peace of mind, something objective, something to prove to myself that nothing was happening. That night, I heard him say my name soft and clear. In the morning, the recording was silent. No distortion, no gaps, just the faint background hum of the apartment. My own breathing, slow and even. I stopped trying to capture it after that. What changed wasn't the voice. It was me. The first few times I felt startled, then confused. After that, wary. Eventually, something like expectation settled in. Not hope, not fear, just readiness. I noticed how carefully he spoke. He never raised his voice, never sounded distressed. He didn't ask questions or say anything that required a response. Most of the time, it was just my name. Once, it was, "You still up?" That was the year I almost answered. I lay there, staring into the dark, the words hovering on my tongue. For a moment, it felt normal to imagine replying, to imagine the conversation continuing the way it used to, unremarkable and gentle. I didn't speak. The voice didn't repeat itself. After that, I stopped trying to deny what was happening, not in a dramatic, acceptance-filled way, more like acknowledging a weather pattern you can't control. It comes, it goes, you adjust. I planned my Valentine's nights carefully. No late dinners, no sleepovers. I stayed home, alone, with the lights low. I didn't drink. I didn't distract myself too much. I wanted to be present without inviting anything. The apartment always felt different on those nights, the air heavier, sounds slightly dulled, as if padded. Time stretched in small, uncomfortable ways. Minutes felt longer than they should have. When the voice came, it was never sudden anymore. There was always a lead-up, a stillness, a sense of waiting. Last year, it happened later than usual. I'd almost convinced myself it wouldn't come at all. The clock read just past 2. I was lying on my back, eyes closed, listening to the faint hiss of the radiator, feeling foolish and relieved at the same time. That was when he spoke. "I found you," he said. The words were quiet, almost thoughtful, not threatening, not emotional, just a statement. I opened my eyes. The room looked unchanged. The ceiling fan was still. The shadows were where they should have been. My heart was beating faster than usual, but not wildly. "I'm here," he added. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I lay there, breathing shallowly, aware of every sensation in my body, the cool air on my face, the warmth under the blankets, the steady pressure of the mattress beneath me. Nothing else happened. In the morning, the feeling lingered longer than it ever had before, a sense of something unresolved. I went through the day distracted, my thoughts circling back to the words, despite my efforts. That night, I checked the calendar. Valentine's Day had passed. It's been a year since then. Tonight, the apartment is quiet again. The radiator hasn't clicked yet. The air feels lighter than it should, like it's thinning out. I'm lying in bed, eyes open, waiting. Not because I want to hear him, but because I've started to understand that whatever voice reaches me on this night doesn't need my permission anymore. I noticed it because her shoes were by the door. They were set neatly against the wall, toes facing inward, exactly the way she used to leave them when she didn't plan on staying long. Not kicked off, not careless, just placed. As if she'd paused there for a moment, thought about it, and decided to be tidy. I stood in the doorway longer than I needed to, keys still in my hand, listening to the apartment breathe around me. The air was still, too still. The faint hum of the refrigerator drifted from the kitchen, steady and low. Somewhere in the building, pipes clicked softly as someone else ran water. I remember thinking that I must be more tired than I realized. I hadn't expected the apartment to feel empty tonight. That was the whole point of coming home late. I'd stayed out on purpose, dragged the evening longer than it needed to be, because the quiet had been getting harder to sit with. But the quiet I felt now wasn't the same kind. This wasn't absence. It felt occupied. I set my keys down slowly, the metal making a small sound against the table by the door. It echoed more than it should have. I waited, without knowing why, for something to respond. Nothing did. Her shoes stayed where they were. I told myself there was an explanation. There always was. Maybe I'd forgotten they were there. Maybe I'd moved them earlier and just didn't remember. Grief does that, people say. It blurs edges, rewrites small details. Still, I didn't pick them up right away. I closed the door, locked it, and leaned back against it for a moment, feeling the solid pressure at my shoulders. The apartment smelled faintly of laundry detergent and old coffee. Familiar smells. Safe smells. The kind that belonged to a routine I'd been clinging to since she died. Her name was Anna. I hadn't said it out loud in days. We'd been together for 3 years. Not dramatic years, not the kind people write about. Just steady ones. Shared grocery lists, late-night takeout. Arguments about thermostat settings and whose turn it was to do dishes. The kind of relationship that quietly settles into your life until you stop noticing where one person ends and the other begins. Valentine's Day had never been a big thing for us. We'd usually forget about it until the day before, laugh about it, promise we'd do something nice next year. This year, I hadn't planned on acknowledging it at all. She died in early February. Sudden. Ordinary. One of those events that doesn't come with warning signs or poetic build-up. Just a phone call. A sentence that didn't sound real. A stretch of time afterward that felt like it belonged to someone else. I hadn't moved any of her things yet. Friends had suggested it gently. Family had avoided the subject altogether. Everyone seemed to assume it would happen naturally, that one day I'd wake up and decide it was time. That day hadn't come, so her shoes stayed by the door, her coat hung in the closet, her toothbrush sat untouched in the cup by the sink. I walked past the shoes and into the living room. The lamp by the couch was on. That stopped me. I stared at it for a second longer than necessary, my mind cycling through possibilities. I almost never used that lamp anymore. It cast too many shadows at night, made the room feel uneven. I preferred overhead lighting now, clean, neutral, harder to imagine things in. I stepped closer and turned it off. The room dimmed immediately, the corners retreating into shadow. The silence pressed in closer than before. I stood there, breathing slowly, listening for something I couldn't name. Nothing happened. I told myself to stop, to move, to act like a normal person in a normal apartment. In the kitchen, everything looked the way I'd left it. Clean counters, sink empty. The small note I'd written to myself that morning still stuck to the fridge. Buy milk. I reached for a glass. There was already one on the counter, half full of water. I froze with my hand inches from it. The glass wasn't warm from sitting out. It wasn't room temperature. When I touched it, my fingers registered cold. Fresh cold. The kind that comes from the tap. I stared at it, my thoughts slowing down, lining up carefully. I hadn't poured a glass of water before leaving that morning. I was certain of that. I'd been running late. I remembered skipping breakfast entirely. I picked up the glass and held it for a moment, feeling the chill seep into my palm. The refrigerator hummed behind me. The clock on the microwave blinked steadily. Everything sounded normal. I poured the water down the sink. I rinsed the glass thoroughly, watching the water swirl and disappear. I placed it upside down in the drying rack, deliberately, as if making a point to someone who wasn't there. When I turned around, I noticed the chair at the small dining table was pulled out slightly. Not much, just enough to catch my attention. I pushed it back in with my foot. The scrape of wood against tile sounded loud in the quiet apartment. That was the moment something shifted. Not fear, not panic, just awareness. I checked the rest of the apartment after that. Bedroom, bathroom, closet, windows, door locks. Everything was secure. Nothing was missing. Nothing was obviously wrong. That night, I went to bed early. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't scroll on my phone. I lay on my back in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the buildings settle around me. Pipes ticked. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened and closed. Eventually, sleep came. I woke up before my alarm. The room felt wrong. Not colder, not warmer, just heavier, like the air had been used and hadn't settled back yet. I lay still, eyes open, listening. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Then I realized I was hearing breathing, slow, steady, not mine. I held my breath. The sound continued for a few seconds, then stopped. I didn't move for a long time after that. When I finally sat up, the room felt empty again. Normal. Quiet. I told myself it had been a dream. In the morning, the glass was back on the counter, clean, dry, exactly where it had been before. I didn't touch it. I stood there holding my coffee, watching steam rise and fade into the air, feeling something settle in my chest that I didn't yet have a name for. That was the first time I thought about her coming back. Not in a hopeful way, not even in a fearful one. Just as a possibility my mind offered quietly, without emotion, as if it were testing the idea. I spent the rest of the day at work replaying small details: the shoes, the lamp, the glass, the breathing. None of it was dramatic. None of it was enough to tell anyone about. When I came home that evening, the shoes were still by the door, neatly placed, waiting. And this time I knew I hadn't left them there. I didn't move the shoes. That was the first rule I made for myself, even though I didn't consciously decide it at the time. I stepped over them when I came in and around them when I left, careful not to disturb their position. I told myself it was because I wanted to be sure I wasn't imagining things, that if they shifted, I'd know for certain whether it was me or not. But the truth was simpler. Moving them felt like acknowledging something I wasn't ready to name. The next morning they were turned slightly, not enough that someone else would notice. Just enough that the left shoe wasn't quite parallel with the wall anymore. The right one was unchanged. I crouched down in front of them, studying the angle like it mattered, like there was something there I could decode if I stared long enough. My heart stayed calm. That bothered me more than the change itself. I adjusted them back to how they'd been before, and stood up slowly, half expecting something to react to the movement. Nothing did. At work, I found myself paying attention to patterns I'd never cared about before. The rhythm of my typing, the timing of footsteps in the hallway, the way conversations paused when someone entered a room. My mind kept circling back to the apartment, replaying it from different angles. By the time I went home that evening, I'd convinced myself there had to be an explanation. Some mechanical failure. A neighbor with a similar key. A delayed grief response that was manifesting in small hallucinations. The apartment greeted me with silence. The lamp was off. The shoes were where I'd left them. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Dinner passed quietly. I ate standing at the counter, not wanting to sit at the table. The chair she used to favor stayed pushed in. I noticed that too. That night, I locked the bedroom door. It wasn't something I'd ever done before, not even after she died. The apartment had always felt safe in a way that didn't require thought. Locking the door felt unnecessary, almost theatrical. Still, I did it. I lay in bed, listening. Nothing happened. I slept. The next morning, the door was unlocked. I stood there, staring at the handle, my fingers resting against the cool metal. I tried to remember waking up, tried to recall the motion of turning the lock, the sound it made. There was nothing. I stood there longer than I should have, then told myself I must have done it without realizing. Muscle memory, half-asleep movements. The explanation felt thin, but I accepted it anyway. That day I found one of her hair ties on the bathroom sink. Black. Elastic stretched slightly, the way it always had been after months of use. It sat beside the faucet, dry, as if it had been placed there intentionally. I picked it up and turned it over in my fingers. I had thrown all of those away. I was sure of it. I didn't remember doing it, but I remembered the decision. The quiet moment in the bathroom weeks earlier, standing over the trash can, knowing I couldn't keep finding them everywhere, that it hurt more to leave them than to let them go. I set the hair tie back down exactly where I'd found it. I started noticing smells after that. Not strong ones, not obvious. Just faint traces that didn't belong. A hint of her shampoo in the hallway. Her laundry detergent lingering in the bedroom long after I'd washed the sheets. At first, I assumed my mind was filling in gaps. Scent is tied to memory. Everyone knows that. But the smells didn't behave like memories. They came and went, shifted locations, appeared where they shouldn't. One evening I came home to find the bedroom window cracked open, just an inch. I stood there staring at it, feeling the cold air spill in around my fingers when I touched the glass. I never opened that window. It faced the alley. The view was nothing but brick and darkness. I closed it and locked it. That night, I dreamed of Anna standing in the hallway. She wasn't facing me. She was turned toward the bathroom, her head tilted slightly, as if listening to something through the wall. She looked exactly the way she had the last time I saw her alive. Same sweater, same loose hair. I tried to speak, but my mouth wouldn't open. She didn't turn around. When I woke up, the smell of her shampoo was strongest it had been yet. I didn't tell anyone about any of this. Saying it out loud felt dangerous. Like putting words to it would make it real in a way I couldn't undo. So I kept it contained, observed, documented. I started taking photos before leaving the apartment. The shoes, the table, the bedroom door. I didn't know what I was expecting to catch, but it made me feel more in control. Sometimes nothing changed. Sometimes small things did. A pillow slightly indented when I got home. A cabinet door left open a few inches. The bathroom mirror wiped clean in a rough oval, as if someone had leaned close to it. I stopped sleeping through the night. Not because I was afraid exactly, more because I felt watched. Not in an aggressive way, not predatory, familiar. Like the sense you get when someone you know is standing just outside your field of vision. On February 14th, I came home later than usual. I hadn't planned it. I just stayed at the office, letting the hours stretch, until the date on my phone felt distant enough not to matter. When I unlocked the door, the apartment was lit. Not brightly, softly. The living room lamp was on. The kitchen light glowed low, casting shadows across the floor. The shoes were gone. I stood there, keys still in my hand, my pulse finally beginning to pick up. I stepped inside slowly. The dining table was set for two. Not elaborately. No candles, no flowers. Just two plates, two glasses, silverware placed neatly on either side. My chest felt tight, but my thoughts stayed strangely clear. This wasn't random. This wasn't confusion. Someone had planned this. I moved closer to the table. One of the glasses was half full of water. The other was empty. On the empty plate, resting neatly in the center, was her ring. The one she always wore on her right hand. Simple, thin band. Slight scratch near the edge from when she dropped it on the sidewalk years ago. I didn't pick it up. I didn't sit down. I stood there, breathing slowly, noticing details I hadn't allowed myself to think about before. The chair on the left, the one she used to sit in, was pulled out slightly. The chair on the right was pushed in. I realized then that nothing had been done carelessly. Nothing was accidental. Whoever, or whatever this was, it remembered. Not just her. Me. I heard movement in the hallway. If you genuinely enjoy slow, unsettling horror stories, like and subscribe. Not footsteps, not a sound I could easily label. Just a shift. Fabric brushing softly against carpet. I turned my head, my body slow to follow. The hallway was empty, but the air felt different there. Warmer. Used. I didn't call out. I didn't run. I stood there, staring as a quiet understanding settled into place. This wasn't about haunting. This wasn't about grief playing tricks on me. This was about presence, about something that had never really left. I backed away from the table and went into the bedroom, locking the door behind me. My hands shook slightly as I did it, but my thoughts stayed calm. That night, I didn't sleep. Sometime just before dawn, I heard the sound again. Breathing. Right outside the door. Slow. Familiar. Patient. And I understood something then that made my stomach turn cold. It wasn't waiting to scare me. It was waiting for me to acknowledge it. I stayed awake until the light outside the window shifted from black to gray. The breathing didn't change. It didn't move closer or farther away. It stayed exactly where it was, as if distance no longer mattered. At some point, I stopped trying to measure it and just listened, my body rigid under the covers, my mind strangely detached. When morning finally came, the sound stopped without warning. No footsteps, no retreat, just absence. I didn't open the door right away. I sat on the edge of the bed, feet flat on the floor, staring at the handle. My reflection stared back at me from the darkened TV screen. I looked older than I remembered. Not tired, hollowed, like something essential had been quietly removed. When I finally unlocked the door, the hallway was empty. The table was still set. The ring was gone. I didn't go to work that day. I spent the morning sitting in the living room, lights off, watching the slow crawl of daylight across the wall. I noticed how familiar the apartment felt, despite everything. The way the air moved, the way sounds carried, how the silence settled after each small noise I made. It felt occupied, not crowded, not invaded, shared. I packed a bag by early afternoon. I told myself I just needed space, a reset, distance. I avoided the thought that followed close behind. That distance hadn't helped before. Before leaving, I walked through each room one last time. Nothing was obviously wrong. The bed was neat, the chairs were pushed in, the bathroom mirror was clean, the window was closed and locked. Everything looked the way it was supposed to. That was what unsettled me the most. At the door, I hesitated. I don't know why I did it. Maybe part of me wanted proof. Maybe part of me already knew what would happen. "I'm leaving," I said quietly. My voice sounded strange in the empty space. I waited. Nothing responded. I locked the door and walked away. I stayed with a friend across town. I didn't explain much, just said I needed a change of scenery. They didn't ask questions. I was grateful for that. The first night there, I slept deeply. No sounds, no smells, no sense of presence pressing in from unseen corners. I woke up disoriented by how normal everything felt. I started looking for a new place the next day. I found one quickly, smaller, brighter. No shared walls, no attic, no history I was aware of. I signed the lease without hesitation. Moving out felt clinical. I took what I needed, left behind things that carried too much weight. I didn't look up at the ceiling once. The apartment stayed quiet the entire time. No signs of resistance, no reminders. That should have felt like relief. It didn't. The new place felt different right away. Cleaner, lighter. The silence behaved the way silence should. When I moved, it moved with me. When I stopped, it settled. I told myself it was over. For a while, it seemed like it was. Weeks passed without incident. I unpacked. I established routines. I stopped checking locks compulsively. I slept with the bedroom door open again. On Valentine's Day, I worked late without realizing the date. When I got home, I found the apartment exactly as I'd left it. I stood there longer than necessary, letting that sink in. That night, I dreamed of Anna again. She was sitting at the edge of the bed, facing away from me. She didn't speak. She didn't turn around. She just sat there, still and patient, like she always had been when she was waiting for me to say something first. When I woke up, the room was empty, but the air smelled faintly of her shampoo. It was barely noticeable, easy to dismiss. I stayed still, listening. Nothing else happened. I don't talk about this anymore. I don't try to explain it. I don't look for answers. I've learned that some things don't want to be solved. They want to be accommodated. Every now and then, I still notice small changes. A chair angled slightly differently than I remember. A light left on. A sense of warmth in an otherwise cool room. I don't investigate. I don't document. I don't confront it. I've learned the pattern now. As long as I don't acknowledge it directly, it remains careful, present, considerate. And sometimes, late at night, when the apartment is quiet in that familiar way, I realize something that still makes my chest tighten. It isn't trying to scare me. It never was. It's just waiting. And it knows I remember. The first thing I noticed was the dust on the bookshelf. Not that it was disturbed in any obvious way. It was still there, a thin gray layer along the top shelf, undisturbed enough that it hadn't caught my attention for weeks. What felt wrong was a narrow, clean line through it, no wider than a finger, running from front to back, as if something had rested there briefly and then been lifted straight up. I stood close, leaning in without touching it, trying to decide if I'd done it myself. The air in the living room was cool, the kind of cool that settles into old wood and stays. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, muted by the kind of overcast winter afternoon that keeps people indoors. I couldn't remember moving anything. I told myself it was nothing. Dust shifts, air moves. Memory is unreliable, especially about small, unimportant details. I brushed the shelf clean with my sleeve and went back to what I'd been doing. That night I slept badly, not because of dreams. I woke several times for no clear reason, each time with the sense that I'd missed something just before opening my eyes. The house felt settled, unchanged. The familiar low sounds of the pipes cooling, the faint hum of electricity in the walls. Nothing out of place. In the morning, the calendar on the fridge caught my attention. February 14th had a small mark on it. Just a short line like the start of a check mark, drawn lightly in pencil. I don't use pencil on the calendar. I use a pen, and I cross days out completely once they're done. I stood there longer than necessary, coffee cooling in my hand, trying to remember when I might have done it. There was no associated thought, no task or reminder it could have been connected to. I erased it and went to work. The second year, it was the sink. I noticed it because the metal felt warm when I washed my hands. Not hot, just warmer than it should have been, as if water had been running recently. I stood there, hands under the tap, listening. The pipes were quiet. I live alone. I always have since the breakup. We'd bought the house together, a modest place on a quiet street, nothing special. When we separated, she'd said it was easier if I kept it. Too many memories for her. At the time, I'd agreed without much thought. After she moved out, I repainted, rearranged, threw out things that didn't feel like mine. I made a point of changing routines, of not letting the space stay frozen in a version of us that didn't exist anymore. It mostly worked. Until February. That second year, I noticed other small things. A kitchen towel folded differently than I remembered. A faint citrus smell near the counter, sharp and clean, the way her soap used to smell. The windows fogged unevenly one morning, the pattern wrong enough to register before I dismissed it. Each thing on its own was easy to explain. Together, they formed something I didn't want to look at too closely. I told myself grief can linger in strange ways, even after relationships end. That memory can project itself onto familiar spaces, that it didn't mean anything. I stopped erasing the calendar after that. By the third year, I was aware of the pattern. Nothing dramatic ever happened on the day itself. No sudden discoveries, no obvious signs. It was always the morning after. The quiet evidence that something had shifted while I wasn't paying attention. A coaster moved slightly off-center. The bathroom mirror, no, not that. I avoided looking there for reasons I couldn't articulate. Instead, it was the medicine cabinet shelf, reorganized in a way that made sense. Just not my sense. The spare change in the bowl by the entry redistributed, quarters stacked instead of scattered. I never found fingerprints, never heard noises. The house never felt invaded in the way you'd expect if someone had broken in. There was no adrenaline, no rush of fear, just a slow creeping recognition that the space had been used, occupied. I considered installing cameras and dismissed the idea just as quickly. Not because I was afraid of what I'd see, but because I wasn't sure what I'd do with the information. Calling someone to explain that nothing was missing and everything was exactly where it should be, except for the parts that weren't. I started staying up later on February 14th. Not intentionally at first. I'd read or watched something mindless until after midnight, telling myself I just wasn't tired. The house felt different at night on that date, not heavier or darker, just attentive. The sounds settled differently. Time stretched. Nothing ever happened while I was awake. The 4th year, I took the 15th off work. I moved slowly that morning, checking rooms one by one without admitting that's what I was doing. The bedroom looked the same. The living room, too. In the kitchen, the fruit bowl had been refilled. Not replaced, refilled. The apples were mine. The oranges weren't. They were smaller, with thin skins and a faint sweetness in the air. She used to buy those. Said they tasted better even if they were harder to peel. I sat at the table and stared at them until the light shifted and the room warmed slightly. I didn't eat one. That was the year I started locking the windows at night, not out of fear, out of principle. I told myself it was just common sense, something I should have been doing anyway. The locks clicked into place with a dull finality that felt reassuring at the time. It didn't change anything. The next morning, the windows were still locked. The house was still intact. The only difference was the living room rug, smoothed in a way I never bothered to do, the fibers all lying in the same direction. I stood there in socks, feeling the texture under my feet, and realized something important. Whatever was happening didn't require entry the way I understood it. After that, the changes became more personal. A sweater I hadn't worn in years was draped over the back of the couch. Not folded, not tossed, just placed there as if set aside temporarily. The scent was faint but unmistakable, clean fabric and something floral underneath. I didn't touch it for 2 days. When I finally did, it was cold. The 5th year, I tried leaving for the night. I booked a cheap hotel across town, checked in early, and spent the evening watching unfamiliar television, eating food I didn't enjoy. I stayed awake until well past midnight, listening to the sounds of strangers in adjacent rooms, telling myself that avoidance was a solution. When I came home the next morning, the house felt disappointed. That's the only word that fits, even now. The air was still, the silence too complete. On the kitchen counter was a grocery receipt from a store I didn't shop at, dated the night before. Nothing on it was unfamiliar. Milk, bread, tea, her tea. I sat on the floor and held the paper until it softened. By the 6th year, I stopped trying to interfere. I didn't lock the windows. I didn't stay up. I didn't leave. I went to bed at my usual time and let the night pass the way it wanted to. There was a strange relief in that, a sense of stepping out of the way. The changes the next morning were subtle, thoughtful. The bookshelf had been reorganized, not dramatically, just enough that books by the same author sat together. A houseplant I'd neglected had been watered. The thermostat? No, I don't want to call it that. The temperature was simply right, comfortable in a way I never quite managed. I stood in the middle of the living room and felt something shift inside me. Not fear, not anger, resignation. I started noticing how I'd changed over the years, how my routines had narrowed, how I avoided making plans in mid-February without consciously deciding to, how the house felt less like a possession and more like a shared responsibility. I stopped dating, not out of loyalty. It just felt complicated to invite someone into a space that wasn't entirely mine. This year, I woke early on the 15th. The house was quiet, the light thin and gray through the windows. On the kitchen table was a notebook I hadn't seen in years. The cover was worn at the edges, the pages inside filled with her handwriting, lists, thoughts, small observations about days that no longer existed. It was open to a blank page. I sat down across from it and waited, though I didn't know for what. The air was cool against my skin. The house held its breath. After a while, I realized something else had changed. The evidence wasn't just that she'd been here, it was that she was staying longer. The house no longer reset itself after February. The small changes remained. The order, the care, the quiet presence woven into daily life. I found myself adjusting around it, leaving space without thinking. I don't know what this place is now, or what it's becoming. I still live here. I still sleep in the same bed. I still wake up alone. But every year, when Valentine's Day passes, I understand a little more clearly that the house remembers her better than I ever could, and that it's done waiting for me to catch up. If you enjoy slow, unsettling horror stories, consider liking the video and subscribing. It was the ribbon that bothered me. Not the box, not the timing, just the ribbon. It was red, narrow, and tied too precisely, the loops pressed flat as if someone had taken their time smoothing them down. It rested on the kitchen counter where I never left anything decorative. I stood there with my coat still on, the grocery bag cutting into my fingers, staring at it longer than made sense. I didn't remember bringing it inside. I set the bag down slowly and waited, listening, as if the room might react to my attention. The refrigerator hummed softly behind me. Outside, somewhere down the block, a car passed, tires hissing faintly on wet pavement. Everything sounded normal. The ribbon didn't belong. I touched it with one finger. The fabric was cool, not stiff, not fresh from a store shelf. It felt handled. The knot held its shape even when I nudged it, like whoever tied it knew how tight was tight enough. I told myself I'd bought something and forgotten. That happens. People forget small things all the time, but I don't buy ribbon. I slid the box toward me and turned it, checking for a label. There wasn't one. No card, no receipt tucked underneath. Just the box, matte white, perfectly square. Valentine's Day was the next morning. That thought came quietly, without urgency. It landed in my head and stayed there while I lifted the lid. Inside was a scarf, dark blue, wool, folded neatly, not creased from shipping, but arranged by hand. I recognized it immediately, or thought I did. She had worn something like it once, years ago. Not this exact one, just similar enough to make my chest tighten in a way I didn't like. I stood there longer than necessary, holding the scarf, trying to place the memory. It wouldn't settle. It floated just out of reach, like a word on the tip of the tongue. I put the scarf back and closed the box. That night, I left it on the counter. I didn't move it. I didn't throw it away. I didn't tell myself any stories about why it was there. I just let it sit where I'd found it. Sleep came late and shallow. I kept waking up with the sense that I'd forgotten something important, though I couldn't say what. When morning finally arrived, gray and quiet, the box was still there. I checked my phone while the coffee brewed. No messages, no missed calls, nothing unusual. I wrapped the scarf around my neck before leaving. I didn't think about why. At work, the day passed without comment. Meetings, emails, routine conversations that required nodding and small smiles. No one mentioned Valentine's Day. I was grateful for that. The scarf drew a couple of compliments. I thanked them and moved on. When I came home that evening, there was another box. This one sat on the dining table, placed carefully in the center, aligned with the edges as if someone had measured the distance. The ribbon was pink this time. Wider, the knot identical. I didn't approach it right away. I set my keys down, took off my coat, listened. The apartment felt settled, the way it always did in the evenings. No sense of movement, no disturbance in the air. I circled the table slowly, as if the box might look different from another angle. It didn't. Inside was a book, a paperback, worn, its corners softened with age. I recognized it instantly. It had been hers, not just a copy like it. The same one. The crease on the back cover, the faint coffee stain near the spine. I'd watched her read it on a long train ride once, her finger marking the page whenever she looked up. I sat down. The chair creaked under my weight. a small, ordinary sound that felt too loud in the moment. I opened the book. The bookmark was still there, a torn strip of paper folded twice. I knew what page it would be on before I turned to it. I closed the book again and pressed my palm against the cover, grounding myself in the texture of it. My heart wasn't racing. My hands weren't shaking. What I felt instead was a slow, spreading certainty that something I'd assumed was finished hadn't been. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I took the book with me to work. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted proof that it existed somewhere other than my apartment. I left it on my desk where I could see it whenever I looked up. Nothing happened. No messages, no deliveries, no sudden moments of recognition from anyone around me. That evening, I came home to an empty table. I stood there longer than necessary, staring at the place where the box had been. The air felt unchanged, ordinary, almost disappointing. I told myself I'd imagined the significance of it, that the gifts had been delayed shipments, old purchases I'd forgotten, that grief does strange things to memory. I believed that explanation for exactly 3 days. On the 4th, the flowers arrived. They were waiting in a glass vase on the windowsill, stems trimmed, water clear. Not roses. She never liked roses. These were smaller, white, the kind that didn't have a strong scent, but still filled a room with something clean and faintly sweet. I stood there watching them move slightly as the heat kicked on, their shadows shifting across the wall with the slow drift of air. I hadn't bought them. I hadn't told anyone my address since moving. I leaned closer and noticed the stems were cut unevenly, as if done with household scissors instead of florist shears. The detail stuck with me more than it should have. I took the flowers with me when I left the apartment that night. I set them in the trash outside, watching them disappear under other bags, convincing myself that was the end of it. The next evening they were back. Same flowers, same vase, same water level. I didn't touch them again. From then on, the gifts came regularly. Not every day, not predictably. Always spaced just far enough apart that I could almost convince myself it wouldn't happen again. A sweater folded on the couch, a framed photograph placed face down on the dresser. Chocolates I remembered her liking left unopened, arranged in a line. Nothing ever accompanied them. No writing, no explanation. What unsettled me wasn't their presence, but their accuracy. Each item matched something specific. A preference, a habit, a memory no one else would have reason to remember. I stopped bringing people over. I stopped mentioning Valentine's Day altogether. One evening, a package arrived that I didn't open right away. It was heavier than the others. Wrapped carefully. No ribbon this time. Just brown paper secured with tape, each strip pressed flat. I left it where it was and sat on the floor across from it, watching the light in the room change as the sun went down. I thought about all the things I hadn't said, all the conversations that ended too early because I'd assumed there would be more time. Eventually, I opened it. Inside was a record, vinyl, black, glossy. The label in the center was handwritten. It was her handwriting. Not a message, just a date. Last year's Valentine's Day. I didn't own a record player anymore. I'd given it away after she died. I held the disc carefully by the edges, afraid of smudging it, as if that would somehow make this less real. The next morning I found a record player on the floor beside the table. Plugged in. I sat down and stared at it until my legs went numb. I played the record. The sound wasn't music. It was quiet at first. Low, almost nothing. Then gradually a room emerged, a familiar room, the faint clink of a spoon against a mug, the hum of an appliance, a soft, absent-minded sound she used to make when she was thinking. I listened until the needle reached the center and lifted itself with a small click. That night, I packed everything I could fit into 2 bags and left. I didn't take the gifts. I didn't take the record. I didn't take anything that felt like it had arrived on its own terms. I moved to a smaller place across town. New routines, new grocery store, new streets. The next Valentine's Day, I told myself it would be different. I woke up early, went to work, stayed late, came home exhausted enough to believe sleep would come easily. On the kitchen counter, waiting where I would see it first, was a single ribbon, red, perfectly tied. This time there was no box, just the ribbon, and beneath it, pressed flat against the surface, was a single strand of dark blue wool, warm, as if it had just been removed.